Now, first, the seat of Moses is a metaphor. The scribes and Pharisees, in other words, are responsible, Jesus says, for teaching the people what Torah requires of them. We shouldn't take things as standalone. Things are not written in a vacuum. So we have to go to the context of the thing. I would argue that the rest of this chapter, Matthew 23, actually stands against Torah observance. And that's beginning with the famous woes in this chapter, which basically are damnation declarations by Jesus. In other words, Jesus saying, so the same people he's directing, people to hear what they say and do, he bashes 7 times, I think, are the woes. And not just here and elsewhere, Jesus is repeatedly found arguing, correcting, and even threatening these Torah teachers. So you got, for example, Mark 12:38, Luke 20, verse 46, without any qualification, destroying these people. He's actually saying, beware of these people, beware of the scribes, is a famous Jesus saying, period. So it's extremely odd to take these verses here, verses 1 and 2, in a vacuum, as if that's, all that Jesus is saying. So this is not a blanket statement. It's not an absolute endorsement, approval of Torah keeping. It's actually similar to a previous situation where Jesus meets, what is it, a young rich man in Matthew 19. The young rich man, who's a young Jewish Torah observant Jew, he says, Jesus, what must I do to be saved? And Jesus says, have you kept the commandments? And then there's a list of commandments, right? And then Jesus says, okay, but you haven't done this. You haven't sold everything, given it to the poor. And then Jesus says something interesting. Okay, now follow me. And the young rich man cannot do it. He cannot sell everything he has and follow Jesus, as the apostles did, by the way. Fishermen, one of the fishermen was, they're working, and Jesus comes up to them and says, follow me. They leave job. Can you imagine? You leave your job? They left. Boom. So this guy's not willing to do that. Now, this is a tactic by Jesus to point to something beyond the Torah commandments that young rich man was adhering to. So, although not completely detached from the Old Covenant Torah, obviously there are elements of it. I mean, obviously the first and greatest of the commandments are, is central to the Torah, the law of Moses, the Shema of Deuteronomy 6:4. And just lastly, back to Matthew 23, note verse 34. Jesus says, because of this, how awful these people are, after he just said, listen to them, do what they tell you, right? Verse 34, I Jesus, am sending you prophets, wise men, and teachers. Think about that, teachers. Did Jesus send Torah keeping teachers? If we're going to isolate those two verses at the start of each chapter, Matthew 23, then you have to say, wait a minute, Jesus, what's going on? And then he says, some of these people I'm sending you, including teachers, you're going to kill, crucify. Others you will flog in your synagogues, persecuting town after town. Why? If those teachers are supposed to listen and obey the Torah teachers of the scribes and the Pharisees. So I would ask you to ask yourself that question. So these verses are not meant to be taken at face value. Previous to this, Jesus had already clashed with Torah teaching when it comes to the Sabbath in Matthew 12. The apostles are breaking the Sabbath, Jesus says. Yes, they're breaking the Sabbath and they're innocent. That's not Torah keeping. He's breaking with purity laws left and right, touching sick people, touching demonized people, even touching the dead. Matthew 15. And then in Matthew 19, verses 3 to 9, Moses told you that, but I tell you, that doesn't sound quite like a Torah keeping Jew to me.